The headlights caught him at the last possible second, a big, brindle shape planted dead center in the wet gravel at the end of Birchwood Lane. Carol yanked the wheel, felt the sedan slide sideways in the rain, and stopped inches from the dog's amber eyes. Bear did not flinch. He just kept staring past the car, toward the bend in the road, waiting for a truck that had not come home in over 1,000 days. Before we go on, drop a comment telling me what part of the world you're listening from, and tap subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Carol sat behind the wheel and felt her own heartbeat kick like a fist inside her chest. The wipers slapped a slow rhythm across the windshield. The dog did not move. He did not even glance her way. It was as if the car had never existed, as if she were made of the same grey air as the rain. She rolled the window down a crack. She said his name softly, twice. Bear only shifted one paw, resettled his weight, and went back to watching the empty road. That was when she understood, in a way that made her stomach fold in on itself, that she had been driving past this exact scene for almost 3 years without letting herself see it. She had grown up on this road. She and Connor had chased each other down that gravel driveway as kids, tumbling in the ditch water, coming home with knees the color of iron. Their father had built the little white farmhouse with his own hands the year before Carol was born. He used to say Birchwood Lane was the kind of place you could not get lost from because the road only went one direction if you were coming home. He was gone 11 years now. Their mother had followed him within 20 months. The house had passed to Connor because Connor stayed. He fixed the porch step. He kept the maple in the front yard, trimmed back from the power line. He worked long hauls in a red logging truck, and he came back down Birchwood Lane every afternoon at 5:30 with the same slow, careful turn onto the gravel. Bear had waited on that same patch of driveway every one of those afternoons since he was a stray pup. Connor had pulled out of a drainage pipe on a job site up near Zanesville. Carol put the car in park and stepped out into the rain. She was crying now, and she did not know when it had started. She walked around the hood, crouched slowly, and laid a hand on the wet slab of the dog's shoulder. He was thinner than she remembered, his ribs pushed at her palm under the sopping fur. She had been telling herself for months that Linda Voss was feeding him. She had been telling herself he was fine, that dogs adjusted, that animals lived in a small present tense that a truck accident and a broken brain could not reach. She had been telling herself a lot of things that were easier than the truth. The truth was sitting in gravel in the rain, refusing to move for headlights because he still had a job to do. She spoke to him, not really expecting him to look at her. She said she was sorry. She said she had been about to sign the papers on an apartment in Columbus this Friday. She said she had told herself it would be simpler that way, cleaner, and that Connor would not know the difference either way because Connor did not know his own name most days. She said Bear would be fine here. That was what she had planned to tell the neighbor. Fine here, alone here. On the end of a driveway, in the dark, in the winter that was coming, watching a road. Bear turned his head then, only slightly, just enough that his amber eyes flicked from the bend of the road to her face. There was no accusation in his look. That was somehow worse than anger. It was patience. It was the patience of an animal that had already decided he would do this until the day his heart stopped and did not need her to understand. Carol drove the 2 hours back to Columbus in the middle of the night with the sound of her wipers still in her head, and by 6 that morning she was on the phone with the leasing agent, letting the apartment go. She had made her decision on the gravel, in the rain, with her hand on the ribs of an animal who had refused to accept what the human world had accepted very quickly. Connor was coming home. She did not care if he did not remember. She did not care if the doctors said he might never remember. He was coming home because there was a dog on a driveway who had already been holding his place for 3 years, and she was not going to be the person who taught that dog how to give up. To understand what Bear was doing on that gravel, you have to go back to the night of the crash. That night belongs to Route 9. Anyone who has driven the stretch between Bellsville and the county line knows it well enough to hate it in the rain. It bends twice, sharp, over a shoulder that drops into pine woods. A red logging truck slid on that shoulder on a wet October night when Connor Hayes was 34 years old. That is the sentence that lived on the front page of the county paper. It is the sentence Carol repeated to herself in the intensive care waiting room for 4 days. It is a very small sentence for what actually happened. What actually happened was that Connor had left a job site at almost 11 at night and was driving home. He had made it past the county garage, past the shuttered farm stand, past the Route 9 sign that no longer had reflective paint on it. He was 2 miles from Birchwood Lane when a second set of headlights came up fast in his mirror, and Connor Hayes said one thing out loud in the cab that no one was there to hear. He said, "Wait, easy, easy now." Then something hit the back left corner of his rig, hard enough to jerk the whole trailer sideways on the wet road. The truck went over the shoulder. The truck rolled twice through the pines. The second set of headlights did not stop. The second set of headlights went home. That was the piece of the story that no one, at first, knew. There were no witnesses. The state trooper who wrote the report said single vehicle, weather-related, wet pavement, driver semi-conscious on arrival. The trooper had done his best, and it was an honest guess. Connor had a fractured skull, a broken hip, a punctured lung, and a swelling in the brain that would keep him under for 11 weeks. When he opened his eyes in a Columbus rehabilitation center on a snowy morning in January, he could not name the woman sitting beside his bed. He could not name the president. He could not name the state. He watched her carefully, the way a polite man watches a stranger on a bus, and he asked in a soft voice full of apology whether she worked there. Carol had not slept a full night in 3 months. She smiled at him. She said no. She said her name was Carol, and she was his sister, and she was here to bring him back. Connor thought about this for a long moment, with the same quiet, careful attention he had given to everything since he had woken up. Then he nodded, because he did not want to be rude. He said, "All right." He said he would try. The doctors used the word remarkable a lot in the first year, and then they used it less, and then they stopped using it. Connor could dress himself. He could shave. He could hold a conversation about the weather. He read the paper every morning, and if you gave him the same paper again the next day, he read it with the same interest. He was gentle with the nurses. He laughed at the small jokes. He learned, or seemed to learn, that the tall woman who came every other Sunday was his sister, and that she was named Carol. And by the middle of the second year, he could greet her by name when she walked in, and Carol would go into the parking garage afterward and press her forehead against the steering wheel of her car and stay there for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive home. She brought him photographs. She brought him the wallet that had been in his pocket at the crash. She brought him a small framed picture of Bear as a puppy, and she pointed to it and said his name. And Connor looked at the picture with polite curiosity. He said, "Oh," he said, "cute." He said, "That is a good-looking dog." Carol asked him if he remembered the dog. Connor looked at her with his kind, absent face and shook his head once, small, and said, "I am sorry, no." Then he apologized again because he could tell it hurt her. He apologized a lot in that second year. Bear had been at the house through all of it. Connor's old friend, Ray Emmett, who ran the small feed store in town, had driven out to Birchwood Lane the morning after the crash and had fed Bear on the porch. Ray kept feeding him for those first 3 months while Connor lay unconscious in Columbus. When Carol finally came out to the house to shut off the water and lock the doors, Bear was sitting in the driveway at 5:30 in the afternoon. She thought it was a coincidence. She fed him. She left him food for a week. When she came back, the food was gone and Bear was in the driveway, and it was 5:30 in the afternoon, and she noticed then, in a small, startled way, what he was doing. Bear did this in August. He did this in January. He did it during the 2 ice storms that took down power for 6 days in a row. He did it when the temperature climbed past 100 degrees for a week in a July that everyone in the county still talked about. He would leave the driveway for a few hours to drink at the creek behind the barn, or to lie in the shadow of the porch when the sun was cruelest. But he was back at his post by 4 o'clock every single afternoon, and he sat there until full dark. And only then would he walk back up the driveway to sleep on the boards under the swing where Connor had liked to sit in summer. Linda Voss lived on the county road, a mile up. She was 68 and she had walked the same rural mail route for 31 years before her knees told her to stop. She had kept walking the route anyway, without the mailbag, because her doctor had told her the walking was the only thing keeping her upright. She noticed Bear about 4 weeks after the crash. She had known Connor since he was a boy. She had known his mother longer than that. She stopped at the mailbox at the end of Birchwood Lane one afternoon, and she set down a chipped enamel bowl of water on the gravel beside the dog, and she waited to see if he would drink. He did not drink while she was watching. He kept his eyes on the bend of the road, on the exact place where the county grader had smoothed the shoulder, where a red logging truck used to turn every afternoon at 5:30. Linda studied him for a long moment. Something in her chest tightened. She had seen a lot in 31 years of walking rural mail. She had seen animals wait for people who were never coming back. But there was a difference she could not put into words between grief and the thing she was watching. This dog was not grieving. This dog was working. She began to walk that stretch every day. She began to bring the bowl. She began to sit on the low stone bench at the edge of the property line, at a distance that respected Bear's watch, and she would speak to him in her steady, careful voice about small things, weather, the way the pear tree by her fence had thrown fruit that year, the neighbor's grandchildren. Bear allowed her to stay. He did not respond, but he did not chase her away. Sometimes, if she stayed until dark, he would lift his head slightly when she stood to leave, and the look he gave her was the look of a co-worker acknowledging another co-worker at the end of a long shift. Linda began, without telling anybody, to keep a small notebook. She wrote down every vehicle that came down Birchwood Lane. She had no reason to do this at first, other than the habit of a woman who had spent 3 decades noticing whose truck was in whose yard. But after a while, she began to include the vehicles that only came to the mailbox and turned around. She noted the color, the make when she could see it, the time. She numbered the pages. It was a private, harmless thing, and it did not feel important at the time, and she almost forgot she was doing it. That was the state of things at the end of the 3rd year. Connor was in Columbus, learning to be a kind and puzzled man in a rehabilitation ward. Bear was on the gravel at the end of Birchwood Lane. Linda Voss was on her stone bench with her notebook. Carol was 2 hours away in the city, 1 phone call away from letting the family house go and putting her brother in a small, clean apartment closer to his doctor's. And Ray Emmett at the feed store was quietly, without asking anyone, putting a bag of dog food on the porch of the Hayes place every 2nd Wednesday, because he had told Connor once, years back, that a man's dog was the man's responsibility, and Connor had agreed. Ray had decided that the deal did not stop working just because Connor could not remember making it. It was Linda Voss who broke Carol's plan for the Columbus apartment, though Carol did not know it yet the night she almost hit the dog. Linda had watched Carol's car go past a dozen times in the previous months. She had noticed the way Carol never stopped, never looked at the driveway, never rolled the window down. She had noticed the woman driving that car the way she noticed everything on that road. And on that wet night, when Carol finally did stop, when she stood in the rain with her hand on the dog and cried, Linda was watching from her own porch a mile up, because Linda watched Birchwood Lane the way other people watch television, and she had seen the sedan brake and pull off. Linda said out loud, to no one, well now. Then she went inside and put water on for tea because she suspected the story on Birchwood Lane was about to change. The morning after Carol let the apartment lease go, She made 2 phone calls she had been avoiding. The first was to the rehabilitation facility in Columbus. She told the discharge coordinator that she wanted to bring Connor home, not to Columbus, not to a supervised apartment, but home, to the farmhouse he had grown up in. There was a pause on the line. Then the coordinator said, in the careful, encouraging tone social workers used, that this was a wonderful plan, and that they would need to schedule a home visit, and that a support team could be arranged through the county. Carol wrote everything down. Her hand shook a little when she wrote. The second call was harder. She called a man named Wade Nolan, who owned Nolan Construction and Development, based in a metal-sided office out on the state highway. Wade Nolan had left 3 messages on her phone in the last 6 months. He had heard, through people who heard things, that the Hayes property was going to be sold. He wanted her to know that he was interested in it. He wanted her to know that he could pay cash, that he could move fast, that he understood the family situation. Carol had listened to all 3 messages and had not called back. On this morning she called back and she told Wade Nolan, politely, that the property was not for sale, that her brother was coming home, and that she thanked him for his patience, but she needed him to please stop calling. Wade Nolan was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he laughed, a small, tight laugh with no amusement in it, and he said, "Well, ma'am, I do appreciate you letting me know." He said, "Of course I understand." He said, "If anything changes, you have my number." Carol thanked him and hung up. She sat at her kitchen table, and she had the strong, unpleasant feeling of a woman who had just told a bank that she was going to be a minute late on a payment. She did not know why. She shook it off. She went back to her list. The home visit took place on a Thursday, 4 days later. 2 women from the county came out to Birchwood Lane in a small white car. They walked through the farmhouse. They checked the wiring. They checked the water. They looked at the porch step Connor had built, and the maple tree in the front yard, and the small pantry with the yellow curtains their mother had sewn in 1987. They wrote things down. Bear watched them from the driveway. When the women went to leave, one of them crouched down at a respectful distance and said, in a voice full of quiet emotion, "Is this him?" Carol said, "Yes, this is Bear." The woman nodded once and stood up and did not say anything else, and Carol saw, before the woman turned her face away, that she was blinking hard. The visit was approved. The date was set. Connor Hayes would come home on a Wednesday in early April. Between the phone call and the date on the calendar, 3 things happened that changed everything, and every one of them started with Bear. The first thing happened on a Sunday afternoon. Carol had driven out to open the house, air it out, get the propane on, wash the windows. She had been at it for hours. Bear was in his usual place at the end of the driveway. Around 3 o'clock, Carol looked up from wringing a rag over the sink and noticed through the kitchen window that the driveway was empty. This was not right. This was not the schedule. She dried her hands and walked outside. She called. She whistled. Nothing. She walked down the gravel to the mailbox, and there was Linda Voss on the low stone bench, and Linda pointed up the fence line toward the woods and said, "He went that way. About an hour ago. He has never done that." Carol looked up the fence line, and Linda said, "I would go with you." They walked together into the pines behind the barn. It had not rained in a week. The ground was soft, but only in the shaded patches. They found Bear about a quarter of a mile in, at the edge of a shallow depression where an old fence post had rotted out years back. He was digging. He was not digging the frantic scrabble of a dog after a groundhog. He was digging in the slow, methodical way of an animal working. Every so often he would stop, sniff, reposition, and dig some more. Carol stood behind him with her arms folded, and she said softly, "Bear, what are you doing?" Bear did not answer. Bear kept digging. Linda took a breath. They dug with him. Carol used her hands. Linda used a flat stone she found near the fence post. About 6 inches down in the wet, cool dirt, They found a small object wrapped in the shreds of what used to be a plastic grocery bag. Carol lifted it out. Bear watched. He did not paw at it. He sat back on his haunches and watched. Carol unwrapped the plastic slowly. Inside was a folded piece of black rubber and shattered plastic about the size of a woman's hand. It was a broken side mirror housing from a large vehicle. It had a company sticker still partly attached to the housing, half torn, and the letters were faded but legible in the low afternoon light. The sticker said NOL-CONST. Underneath the letters was a small logo, a stylized excavator arm, and below that in tiny print, the phrase "serving the Tri-County area since 1996. Carol looked at Linda. Linda looked at Carol. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Carol turned the mirror housing over in her hands. There was a long streak of red paint down the black plastic, the kind of red used on logging trucks. A truck like Connor's. Carol thought about the phone call she had made to Wade Nolan 4 days before. She thought about the small, tight laugh he had given her at the end of the call. She said, out loud, in a voice that felt strange in her own mouth, "Oh." Bear stood up. He turned and started walking back through the pines toward the driveway, slowly, the way he had walked out. Carol and Linda followed him. Bear went back to his post at the end of the gravel and sat down and stared at the bend of the road, exactly as if nothing had happened. Carol did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse with the broken mirror housing in front of her, and she made a list of everything she remembered about the state trooper report from 3 years back. Single vehicle, weather-related, wet pavement, no paint transfer noted. She read the report twice more, the copy sheriff's office had given her, and it said no paint transfer noted, and there was a photograph of the back left corner of Connor's rig where the tow crew had dragged it out of the pines. The corner was mangled. Any paint that might have been on it had come off in the roll. Carol thought about the exact wording again. No paint transfer noted, and she understood that this was not the same thing as no paint transfer. The second thing happened the next weekend. Carol had spent the week talking herself out of what she suspected. She had told herself the mirror could have been anything. Some Nolan construction truck could have taken the bend too hard 3 months back, could have clipped a deer, could have lost a mirror. Bear could have dragged it in from the road. It did not have to mean what her mind was insisting it meant. She was almost calm again by Saturday morning. Then she came home to the farmhouse at 11 at night after a full day at work, and Bear was not in the driveway. He was on the porch. He was standing at the front door with his hackles up. He was not barking. He was doing the low, chest-deep growl that a dog only makes when a dog means it. Every hair down his spine was raised. Carol froze at the bottom step. She said his name softly. Bear did not turn. He kept staring at the door. The front door of the farmhouse was ajar. Carol backed away from the porch. She got in her car. She locked the doors. She called 911. 2 sheriff's deputies came out inside of 20 minutes, one older, one very young. They swept the house with flashlights. They found no one. They found a window pried open in the small mudroom at the back. They found drawers pulled out in the front room. They found the small metal file box, where Connor had kept his important papers open on the kitchen counter with its contents fanned across the wood, and in the middle of the papers, the folder that had contained the deed to the property, and the folder that had contained the discharge paperwork from the Columbus Rehabilitation Facility, and the copy of the state trooper's report from the night of the crash, were all missing. The older deputy took the report standing on the porch. He wrote slowly. He said, in a careful, neutral voice, "Ma'am, do you know anybody who might have wanted these particular papers?" Carol said, "Yes." She said, "I think I might." She told him about the phone call with Wade Nolan. She told him about the mirror in the woods. She did not tell him about Bear yet. The deputy wrote. He looked up at Bear, who had settled but was still watching the door, and he said, "That is one hell of a dog, Mom," Carol said. "I know." The third thing happened 3 days later, and it was Linda Voss who made it happen. Linda came down the road on foot with her notebook under her arm. She sat on the low stone bench at the end of the driveway, and she waited for Carol to come out. When Carol did, Linda opened the notebook and turned to a page dated the previous October, 3 years back. She said, "I did not know why I was doing this at the time." She said, "But I have been keeping this book for a long time." She turned the book toward Carol. On the page for October the 12th, the night Connor's truck went off Route 9, Linda had written in her steady square handwriting a list of every vehicle she had noticed on the county road. There were 3 entries. The third entry at 10:44 at night said white flatbed, Nolan Construction going west, fast. Not Wade. Younger driver. She had drawn a small question mark next to the entry because she had not been able to see the face clearly from her porch. Carol looked at the notebook. She looked at Linda. Linda closed the book gently. She said, "My husband was a deputy for 22 years, honey. He used to say the small things sit on people until people are ready." Carol said, "Thank you." Linda said, "You thank me by not letting them push you off this land." Carol said, "I do not know how yet." Linda said, "You will know how. That dog knows how. You just watch him." Carol took the notebook and the mirror housing and everything else to the sheriff's office in town on a Tuesday morning. She spoke with a woman investigator named Deputy Whitaker, who had short grey hair and a very steady way of listening. Whitaker took notes for almost an hour. She asked good questions. She asked whether Bear was reliable, whether he had a history of aggression, whether Linda's notebook had been continuous or spotty. She wrote it all down. At the end, she leaned back in her chair and she said, "Ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. What you are describing is a 3-year-old accident with a busted mirror, an eyewitness who did not see a face, and a break-in with no fingerprints. This is not a case yet. But I have known Wade Nolan for 11 years, and I have wondered about Wade Nolan for 9 of them, and I am going to look at this." She said, "In the meantime, I would keep that dog close." Carol said that will not be difficult. She almost stood to leave. Then she remembered and she asked. She said, "One more thing. Would you want to see the mirror? I have it in my car." Deputy Whitaker said, "Please." Carol went out to the parking lot and came back with the mirror housing in a plastic bag. Whitaker took it in gloved hands. She turned it slowly under her desk lamp. She looked at the sticker. She looked at the red paint. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly without looking up, "Oh, you dumb son of a bitch, you kept the wrong truck." Carol did not understand at first. Whitaker looked up at her. Whitaker said, "Wade Nolan bought a used company truck at auction about 6 months after your brother's accident. Kind of quiet purchase. My husband works at the tag office. Wade retired one of his own flatbeds around the same time. If we can find that flatbed, we might find where this mirror belongs." She said, "But that is my job, not yours. Go home. Take care of your brother. Take care of that dog." She paused. She said, "Ma'am, thank you for coming in." Carol drove home in a kind of daze. The pieces were starting to fit together in her mind, but they were not yet a picture. Wade Nolan wanted the Hayes property. He had wanted it for years, apparently. What had changed 3 years ago? What could have made a man decide to run a logging truck off Route 9 on a wet October night? She turned that over in her head all the way back to Birchwood Lane, and when she pulled into the driveway, Bear was on the porch, upright, tail low, watching her arrive with the same careful, patient attention with which he had watched everything else. She got out of the car and walked to him, and knelt on the boards and put her forehead against his, and she said, "Thank you." Bear did not move. He allowed it, the way he had allowed Linda on the stone bench, the way he allowed everything about this 3-year vigil. He was doing his job. He was not going to be moved off of it. That night, Carol sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and she made herself a timeline, going back further than she wanted to. She wrote down every scrap she could remember about the year before the accident. Connor had been in a good place then, she recalled. He had been dating a woman named Melanie for a few months, though it had cooled by summer. He had picked up a bigger contract with a mill in West Virginia, driving longer routes. He had been happy, or as close to it as Connor got. What had happened just before the accident? Carol pressed her memory hard. She remembered dimly that Connor had come to her house in Columbus for a Sunday supper in late September, and he had mentioned over dessert that some developer had approached him about the property. He had laughed about it. He had said he offered me $80,000, sissy, like I would sell our dad's house for $80,000. He had told the developer no. He had made a joke about it. He had eaten Carol's peach cobbler. He had driven back to Birchwood Lane. 2 weeks later, he had been on the shoulder of Route 9. Carol wrote the name Wade Nolan on the legal pad. She underlined it. She sat very still. The days ran up to the Wednesday of Connor's homecoming. Deputy Whitaker called twice with small updates. She had found the auction record for the retired Nolan flatbed. She was trying to trace where it had gone from there. She would not say more. She said, "Do not talk about this to anybody." Carol said, "Understood." Connor came home on a Wednesday in early April at exactly 2 in the afternoon. He rode in the passenger seat of Carol's sedan with a small canvas duffel between his feet. He looked out the window at every farm, every silo, every mailbox. He said, "This is nice country." Carol said yes. She did not press him to remember it. She had learned not to. He looked at the sign for Birchwood Lane when they turned in, and he read the words aloud, slowly, the way he read every sign, and he said, "That is a pretty name." Carol said, "It is where you live." Connor considered this. He nodded politely. He said, "All right." She pulled up to the farmhouse and stopped the car. She put it in park. She turned to him. She said, "Before we go in, there is somebody who has been waiting for you." Connor looked at her with his soft, careful eyes. He said, "Oh?" Carol said, "Yes." She opened her door and got out and walked around and opened his door for him, and he stepped out onto the gravel of the driveway, and Bear was already coming. Bear did not run. Bear had never been a dog that ran. Bear walked out from the porch with his amber eyes fixed on Connor's face, and he did not wag his tail, and he did not bark. He walked the length of the gravel in the sunlight of a mild spring afternoon, and he stopped 1 foot away from the man he had been waiting for, and he pressed his broad, brindle head against Connor's left hand, the hand that had held the leash. He pressed his head against that hand, and he closed his amber eyes. Connor went very still. Carol had prepared herself for many possibilities. She had prepared herself for confusion. She had prepared herself for polite friendliness. She had prepared herself for nothing at all, for the dog to be to Connor what everything else in the world had been. A strange, kind object that he would smile at gently and move past. She had not prepared herself for what happened. Connor stood there with the dog's head against his hand. His fingers moved once, twice, then closed around the loose fur at Bear's neck the way they had closed 1,000 times before. His breath came out ragged and long. He made a sound in his throat that was not a word, that was more like the sound a man makes when something he did not know he had been holding suddenly cannot be held anymore. He dropped to one knee on the gravel. Bear stepped forward the last foot and pressed against him. Connor put both arms around the dog's neck. He put his face into the fur. Carol stood by the car with her hand over her mouth. She did not say a word. She understood, watching them together, that whatever the doctors could not give back, the dog had just returned in one quiet, unhurried moment at the end of a gravel driveway. They stayed like that for a long time. When Connor finally lifted his face, his cheeks were wet. He looked at Carol, and he opened his mouth to say something and closed it again. He looked at the dog. He looked at the porch of the farmhouse. He looked at the maple tree in the front yard. Then he looked back at Carol, and he said in a voice that was very small, "Sis." He said it the way he had said it their whole lives together. Nobody had called Carol sis in 3 years and 2 months. Carol crossed the gravel to him. She knelt beside him. She put her arms around her brother and around the dog together, and the three of them stayed on the driveway of the farmhouse their father had built for a long time. And nobody said anything else because nothing else was needed. That evening on the porch, with Bear stretched flat across Connor's feet, Connor watched the sun go down over the pear tree at the fence line. He said, "I do not remember everything." He said, "I remember him." He looked down at the dog. He said, "I do not know how, but I remember him." Carol said, "That is enough." Connor said, "No." He said, "I want to remember more." He said, "I want to remember all of it." He said, "Will you help me?" Carol said, "Yes." She had not told him yet about the mirror in the woods. She had not told him about the break-in. She had not told him about Wade Nolan or Deputy Whitaker or Linda's notebook. She had promised herself she would give him a week. She would let him get used to the house. She would let him get used to his own bed and the sound of the pump in the well and the way the porch step creaked. Then she would tell him gently that there were some things she had been working on. She would give him the choice. She had a week. She did not know she had a week. That is the thing about weeks. On the 4th day, a lawyer's letter arrived at the farmhouse in a heavy cream envelope with a stamped seal. Carol opened it at the kitchen table with Bear at her feet and Connor at the sink washing the coffee cups. She read it twice. She set it down. She said, "I need to make a phone call." Connor said, "All right, is everything okay?" Carol said, "Yes." She lied to her brother for the first time in her life. She went out on the porch and she called Deputy Whitaker. Whitaker answered on the 2nd ring. Carol read her the letter. It was from a firm in Columbus. It said, "On behalf of Wade Nolan and Nolan Construction and Development, we are filing a petition with the county probate court to have Connor David Hayes evaluated for competency to manage his own affairs, and if found not competent, to have a court-appointed guardian named for the purposes of asset management, including but not limited to real estate, held in the name of Connor David Hayes." The petition would be heard in 6 weeks. Carol was named as a party. So was the probate judge. So was the county. Whitaker was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That is what a man does when he thinks he is running out of time." Carol said, "Running out of time for what?" Whitaker said, "I found the flatbed. I found where Wade sold it. He sold it to a scrapyard up near Mansfield. The scrapyard cut it into pieces 2 months later. But before they cut it, they took photographs for insurance. There is a photograph of the front left corner of that truck with no side mirror at all. And there is red paint on the fender, and the shape of the damage on the fender lines up exactly with the shape of the back corner of your brother's rig." She said, "I have the photograph. I have the sales record. I have the auction paperwork. I have Linda Voss's notebook. I have the mirror." She said, "I do not have who was driving." Carol asked the question she had been dreading. She said, "Was Wade driving?" Whitaker said, "I do not think so." She said, "Wade was at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in town that night. 30 people saw him." Carol said, "Then who?" Whitaker said, "That is what I've been trying to find out." She said, "I have a name I'm looking at, but I cannot tell you yet because I could be wrong." She said, "Give me 2 more weeks." She said, "And if that letter frightens you, do not let it. That letter tells me he is scared. Scared men make mistakes." Carol said, "Okay." Whitaker said, "One more thing." She said, "How is your brother?" Carol said, "He is home." She said, "My God, he is home." Whitaker was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, in a softer voice, "All right then, we are going to keep him home." Carol went inside, and she sat down at the table with Connor and Bear, and she told them. She told her brother everything. She told him about the crash, the way it had actually happened. She told him about the mirror in the woods and Bear digging and Linda's notebook and the break-in. And Wade Nolan and the letter from the lawyer and the photograph of the flatbed. She told him plainly. She did not sugarcoat any of it. She had promised herself she would give him a week, and she had given him 4 days. And she thought, watching his careful face across the table from her, that 4 days had been long enough. Connor listened. He did not interrupt. He held his coffee cup in both hands, and he watched her, and when she was done, he did not say anything for a while. Then he looked down at Bear, who had lifted his head at some point during the story and had put his chin on Connor's knee. Connor put one hand on Bear's head. He said slowly, "So somebody tried to kill me." Carol said, "I do not know if they meant to kill you. I think they meant to scare you." Connor thought about this. He said, "And now they are trying to take the house." Carol said, "Yes." Connor said, "And Bear knew." Carol said, "Yes, Bear knew." Bear knew everything. Connor was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said in his soft, careful voice, "I do not remember the crash. I do not remember driving. I do not remember Route 9. I do not remember who I was on that road." He said, "But I am going to tell you something, sis." He looked up at her. He said, "I remembered him." He nodded at the dog. He said, "I remembered him without being told. If I remembered him, then that memory is somewhere in me. If that memory is in me, then the other memory might be in me too." Carol did not answer. Connor said, "If this Wade Nolan wants a fight over our father's house, we are going to give him a fight." Carol said, "Okay." Connor said, "And I am going to try to remember. I am going to try every day." Carol said, "Okay." Connor said, "Will you help me?" Carol said, "Yes." She said it for the second time in 4 days, and she meant it more this time. The next 6 weeks were a slow, difficult season. Every morning Connor got up at 6:30, drank coffee on the porch with Bear at his side, and did the small exercises the rehabilitation specialists had given him. He looked at old photographs. He walked the fence lines with Bear. He touched things. He touched the porch step his father had built. He touched the hinge on the barn door that he had replaced himself the summer he was 22. He climbed into the cab of his old pickup, which had sat under a tarp in the barn for 3 years, and he sat behind the wheel and he closed his eyes. Sometimes something came back to him. Small things, the name of the mill supervisor in West Virginia, the song that had been playing on the radio the first afternoon he had brought Bear home as a puppy. Once, the smell of his mother's kitchen. Never the crash, never Route 9. Carol drove into town almost every day. She met with a lawyer, a soft-spoken older man named Everett Klein, who had been the family's attorney since before Carol was born. Klein read the petition Wade Nolan's people had filed. He read Deputy Whitaker's summary. He shook his head once, slowly. He said, "This is going to come down to 2 things." He said, 1, whether we can put Connor in front of that judge in 6 weeks and have him seem like a man who can manage his own affairs. 2, whether we can put doubt in that judge's mind about Wade Nolan's motives. He said, "I think we can do both." He said, "But they are going to fight like hell." Carol said, "We can fight too." Klein smiled a small, worn smile. He said, "Honey, I know. I remember your father." Deputy Whitaker worked her end. She was careful. She was slow. She did not tell Carol what she was finding until she was sure. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the hearing, she called Carol and asked her to come to the sheriff's office alone. Carol went. Whitaker had a manila folder on her desk. She had 2 photographs paper-clipped to the top of the folder. Whitaker said, "Sit down, please." Carol sat. Whitaker turned the first photograph over. It was a driver's license photo of a young man, 22 or 23, with a wide, friendly face, a bit of stubble, dark hair cut short. Whitaker said, "This is Cody Nolan. He is Wade Nolan's son. He works for the company. He would have been 19 years old on the night of the crash." Carol looked at the face. She did not recognize it. Whitaker said, "He was arrested for a DUI in the county in 2018. He was arrested for reckless driving in 2019. Both times the charges were reduced. Both times the arresting officer got a phone call from somebody in the sheriff's office 2 days later. Both times Cody walked." She said, "The officer both times was a friend of my late husband. He is retired now. He has been waiting a long time to tell somebody what he saw." She turned the second photograph over. It was a picture of a young man leaning against a white flatbed truck, laughing, a cigarette in his hand, the excavator arm logo of Nolan Construction visible on the door behind him. The photograph had been posted on a social media page 4 years ago. In the top corner of the truck cab, half caught in the sun, was the passenger side mirror. Whitaker put her finger on the mirror. She said, "That is the mirror. That is the exact mirror. I had our tech guy match the housing shape and the sticker placement. It is the same mirror." Carol looked at the photograph. Her hand shook slightly. Whitaker sat back. She said, "I do not have a confession yet. I do not have Cody. I know he is out of state right now. He has been in Georgia for 3 months on a job site the company is running down there. I have talked to the state boys about picking him up. I want him in a room." She said, "But I have enough for the hearing. Klein can put me on the stand. I can talk about the flatbed, the mirror, the paint, the timing. I can raise the question. Once the judge hears the question, the petition against your brother is dead." She said, "And once Cody is in a room, I think Wade Nolan is going to be in a lot of rooms he does not want to be in." Carol said, "Thank you." Whitaker said, "You thank Bear. He is the reason we have the mirror. He is the reason anybody was looking." Carol said, "I thank Bear every day." She drove home that evening in a state she could not describe. She drove down Birchwood Lane in the low honey light of a spring afternoon, and she saw, from a distance, the 2 figures on the porch. Her brother, in a wooden chair, reading the paper. Bear on the boards at his feet. She stopped the car halfway up the drive, and she just looked for a moment. She thought, "This is what our father built." She thought, "This is the whole point." Connor looked up as she came up the porch steps. He said, "You look like you have news." Carol said, "I do." She told him everything she had just heard. Connor listened. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Cody Nolan." Carol said, "Yes." Connor turned the name over. He said, "That name is doing something to me." He said, "I do not know what." Carol did not push him. She sat down beside him. She said, "Take your time." The last 2 weeks before the hearing were the hardest. Wade Nolan's lawyers filed motions. Carol's lawyer filed responses. Deputy Whitaker worked the state, worked the phones, worked her sources. Cody Nolan was located in Georgia and asked to return to the county for questioning. He refused through his father's attorney. Whitaker filed for a material witness order. The state attorney's office got involved. The Georgia authorities were called. Cody Nolan was going to be brought back on a plane, whether he liked it or not. And Wade Nolan understood, somewhere in the middle of that second week, that he had lost the calm control of the story he had been telling for 3 years. Wade made one more move. It was on a Friday night, 9 days before the hearing. Carol answered the front door of the farmhouse and found a well-dressed man on the porch she had never seen before. He introduced himself as an attorney representing Nolan Construction. He said his firm was prepared, on behalf of his client and in a spirit of goodwill, to offer Mr. Hayes a settlement of $250,000 in exchange for a signed agreement that the family would not pursue any civil actions against Wade Nolan or any member of his family or company, and would drop any support for criminal proceedings arising from the events of October 12th. The attorney had a very clean folder. He offered the folder to Carol. Carol did not take the folder. She said, "Please wait right there." She walked into the front room. Connor was in his chair with Bear at his feet. Carol said, "There is a man on the porch." She told him what the man had offered. Connor listened. He put down the paper. He said, "Sis, go ask him something for me." Carol said, "What?" Connor said, "Ask him if the offer includes an admission that Cody Nolan ran me off Route 9 on October 12th and that Wade Nolan has been trying to bury it ever since." Carol nodded once. She went back to the porch. She asked. The attorney's face did not move much, but the small muscle at the corner of his jaw did. He said, "That is not the way settlements work, Ma'am," Carol said. "Then Mr. Hayes says no." She said, "Please leave." The attorney left. Bear watched him go from the top of the porch step. He did not growl. He did not have to. Wade Nolan's lawyers did not withdraw the competency petition. They pushed forward with it because pushing forward was the only card they had left, and because they were, by that point, playing more for the appearance of confidence than for any real chance of winning. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse in town. The night before the hearing, Carol packed her brother's Sunday clothes and laid them out on the bed. Connor stood in the doorway and looked at them. He said, "Sis, one thing." Carol said, "Yes." Connor said, "I want to bring Bear." Carol said, "Into the courthouse?" Connor said, "Yes." Carol said, "They will not let a dog into a courthouse." Connor said, "Ask them." Carol said, "All right." She called Everett Klein that night. Klein sighed on the phone, then he chuckled, then he sighed again, then he said, "Let me make one call." He called her back inside of 40 minutes and he said, "The judge said yes." The judge said, quote, "If that dog has waited 3 years to walk into my courtroom, that dog can walk into my courtroom." Carol said, "Thank you." Klein said, "Thank the judge," and thank the dog. The morning of the hearing was bright and cold. Frost sat white in the low places along the road until the sun climbed high enough to burn it off. Carol drove Connor into town with Bear in the back seat, upright, alert, watching the road the way he used to watch the driveway. They pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse at 9:15 in the morning. Linda Voss was already there. She had walked 3 miles in her good church coat. She had her notebook under her arm. She hugged Carol without saying anything. She hugged Connor without saying anything. She scratched Bear behind the ear and then held her hand there for a second longer than was necessary. She said, "Come on." She said, "We have work to do." Wade Nolan was already inside, in the front row on the far side of the courtroom, in a grey suit. His attorneys, 3 of them, sat at the table in front of him. He did not look at Carol as she came in. Carol sat with Connor at the table on the other side, with Everett Klein beside them. Bear lay down on the floor at Connor's feet, laid his broad head across Connor's shoes, and did not move. The judge came in. He was a lean older man with round glasses and a plain brown gavel. He looked once at Bear. His mouth did a small thing at one corner. Then he called the hearing to order. Wade Nolan's lead attorney went first. He was smooth, he was practiced. He said all the correct things. He said the petition was not adversarial, that it was a matter of concern for Mr. Hayes's welfare, that Mr. Hayes had suffered a devastating brain injury 3 years back, and that objective medical evaluation was required. He entered into the record the discharge summary from the Columbus Rehabilitation Facility. He entered into the record the notes of the 2 most recent neurological assessments. He spoke for almost 40 minutes. He was polite the whole time. Bear did not move. Then Everett Klein stood up. Klein was not smooth. Klein was slow. He was the kind of country lawyer who spoke the way a man loads a wagon, one careful thing at a time. He entered into the record the report of Connor's most recent neuropsychological evaluation, which had been done by a doctor of Klein's own choosing, and which stated that Mr. Hayes had made continued recovery, that he was oriented to person, place, and time, that he understood the nature of his property and finances, and that he was legally competent to manage his own affairs under the standards of the state. Klein said, "But with the court's permission, I would like to call 2 witnesses before we discuss competency." The judge said, "Please proceed." Klein called Linda Voss first. Linda came up to the stand in her good coat. She was sworn. She sat. Klein asked her gently whether she had known Connor Hayes and his family for a long time. Linda said, "All my life." Klein asked whether she was in the habit, as a retired mail carrier, of noting the vehicles that came and went on the county road. Linda said, yes. Klein asked, on the night of October 12th, 3 years ago, "Did you observe any vehicles that struck you as unusual?" Linda opened her notebook. She read the entry, "White flatbed, Nolan Construction going west fast. Not Wade. Younger driver. 10:44 at night." The courtroom was very quiet. Wade Nolan's lead attorney stood up quickly and objected to the relevance. The judge overruled him mildly and said, "This hearing is about the credibility of the petitioner as well as the respondent counsel. Sit down." Klein called Deputy Whitaker second. Whitaker was in her uniform. She was sworn. She sat. Klein asked her to explain what she had found in the course of her investigation. Whitaker did. She spoke plainly. She described the mirror housing, the paint, the auction, the retired flatbed, the photograph from the scrapyard, the social media picture of Cody Nolan. She entered each item into evidence. Wade Nolan's attorney objected 6 times. The judge overruled him 6 times. When Whitaker was done, the room was completely still. Klein turned back to the judge. He said, "Your Honor, 3 years ago, somebody in a Nolan Construction flatbed ran a logging truck off the road on Route 9 at 10:44 at night, and that logging truck was driven by Connor Hayes. And Wade Nolan has spent the last 3 years quietly trying to acquire the property of the man his own family put in a rehabilitation ward." This petition is not about Mr. Hayes's welfare. This petition is the last move of a man who is watching the ground open up under him. He said, "We ask the court to deny the petition." He sat down. The judge looked at Wade Nolan. Wade Nolan looked at his own hands. The judge looked at Connor Hayes. The judge said, "Mr. Hayes, would you like to say anything on your own behalf?" Connor stood up. He stood up slowly, carefully, the way he did everything. Bear stood up with him because Bear had felt him rise. Connor put one hand on the back of the chair to steady himself. He looked at the judge. He looked at Wade Nolan across the aisle. Then he looked at the small folded piece of paper in his hand. Carol had not known he was holding a paper. Connor said, "Your Honor, I do not remember the night of October 12th. I want to say that plain. I have tried to remember it for 3 years. I have tried very hard. Some days I get close, most days I do not." He looked down at the paper. He said, "But there is one thing I remembered this weekend." He said, "I remembered it because my sister told me a name. The name was Cody Nolan." The courtroom did not move. Connor said, "I remembered a job site up near Zanesville. 3.5 years ago, little job. I was helping clear some scrub for a barn expansion. There was a young man there from the developer's company. He came around the site. He asked about my truck. He asked about my property down on Birchwood Lane. He said, 'So you are that Hayes?' He said, 'My dad has been trying to buy your place for years.' I said, 'Well, tell your dad it is not for sale.' He laughed. He said, 'Everything is for sale, mister.' I said, 'You have a nice day now.' He kept smiling. He said, 'We will see you around.'" Connor looked at Wade Nolan across the room. He said, "That young man was your son." He said, "I did not know it at the time, but I knew his face. I remembered his face this weekend. I have been standing at my kitchen sink and remembering his face for 2 days." Wade Nolan's mouth had opened slightly. He was staring at Connor with the expression of a man who had just heard a door open in a room he had been sure was locked. Connor said, "Your Honor, I remember another thing." He said, "I remember driving home on Route 9. I remember the headlights coming up in my mirror. I remember thinking that fella is going way too fast on this wet road. I remember him coming up beside me. He said, "I remember looking through my window and looking through his window, and I remember the face in the other cab. The face was laughing." He said, "And then something hit me and my truck went sideways, and I went over the shoulder and I heard my dog barking somewhere very far away, and I knew I was not going to be home at 5:30 that day." He said, "I did not remember any of that a week ago. I remembered it this morning. I've been sitting in that chair over there for the last hour and remembering it." Bear leaned against his leg. Connor looked at the judge. He said, "Your Honor, I know my own name. I know where I live. I know what my father built. I know who my dog is. I know who tried to take all of it. I would like to keep it, please." The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Wade Nolan's lead attorney. He said, "Counsel, do you have any further argument?" The attorney said, in a voice that did not sound like his own voice, "No, Your Honor." The judge said, "The petition is denied." He said, "Mr. Nolan, sit down." Wade Nolan had not stood up. The judge said, "I know. I mean it as a general instruction." He picked up his gavel. He said, "This court stands adjourned pending investigation and possible referral to the state's attorney." He said, "Mr. Hayes." Connor said, "Yes, sir." The judge said, "Welcome home." He brought the gavel down. The room broke into the small, ordinary sounds of a room after a hearing. Chairs, papers, someone crying softly in the second row, and Carol realized after a moment that it was her. Bear stood pressed against Connor's leg. Wade Nolan stood up on the other side of the aisle with the flat, empty look of a man who had watched something he had spent 3 years building come apart in 10 minutes. His attorneys were already gathering their papers. Whitaker met Wade in the aisle. She was polite. She said, "Mr. Nolan, we are going to need to speak with you at the sheriff's office this afternoon. Please do not leave the county." Wade nodded once. He did not look at her. He walked out of the courtroom with his attorneys around him like a small fence. Carol watched him go. She thought, oddly, of the small, tight laugh he had given her on the telephone a lifetime ago when she had told him the property was not for sale. She thought, "That was your last laugh and you did not even know it." They walked out of the courthouse into the noon sun. Linda Voss was there. Ray Emmett from the feed store was there, though Carol had not known he was coming. Deputy Whitaker was there. A small handful of neighbors from the county road who had heard something was happening today were there. Nobody said much. Somebody put a hand on Connor's shoulder. Somebody else scratched Bear behind the ear. Ray Emmett cleared his throat twice and finally said, "Damn glad you are home, Con." Connor smiled his soft, careful smile. He said, "Thank you, Ray." He said, "I hear you have been keeping my dog in feed." Ray looked embarrassed. He said, "Well." Connor said, "I owe you 3 years of feed." Ray said, "You owe me nothing." He said, "You would have done the same for mine." Connor thought about that. He said, "Yes, I would have." Cody Nolan was flown back to the county 3 days later on a warrant. He was arrested at the small county airport by 2 state troopers and 1 sheriff's deputy, who was Deputy Whitaker. He was charged with vehicular assault, hit and run, and obstruction. In the sheriff's interview room, with his father's attorney beside him, he broke inside of 2 hours. He said he had not meant to run the truck all the way off the road. He said he had only meant to scare him. He said his father had told him to lean on the guy, get him to see reason on the property. He said his father had not told him to use the truck. Cody had used the truck because Cody had been 19 and stupid and had thought it would be funny. He had watched the logging rig go over the shoulder in his mirror, and he had panicked and driven home. He had told his father the next morning. His father had told him to keep his mouth shut. His father had retired the flatbed within the month. His father had gone on, paying the mortgage on his son's condo for the 3 years that followed. Wade Nolan was arrested that evening on charges of accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. The witness tampering was the break-in. The break-in was Wade himself. He had come through the mudroom window at 58 years old, in the dark, looking for the trooper's report. and he had not known that there was a brindle mutt on the porch who had already decided the front door was his responsibility. He had not stolen anything of value. He had barely stolen anything at all. He had made himself, in the end, one more small, ordinary thief in the record of the county sheriff's office. The company he had spent 30 years building announced within the month that it was suspending operations. His 2 largest municipal contracts were reviewed and cancelled. His name became something people did not say out loud in the diner in town. Justice moved at the pace justice moves at in the country, which is slower than a person wants and faster than a person expects. There would be a trial, there would be plea negotiations, there would be a small paragraph in the county paper on many separate days. Cody Nolan would eventually serve 4 years in state prison. Wade Nolan would eventually serve 2. The civil suit that Everett Klein filed on behalf of Connor Hayes would eventually settle for an amount that made sure the farmhouse on Birchwood Lane would never again need to worry about a bank or a lawyer or a man in a grey suit on the porch. None of that mattered much on the afternoon of the day of the hearing. That afternoon, Carol drove her brother and his dog home to the farmhouse. She pulled up to the top of the gravel driveway. She stopped the car. She got out. Connor got out. Bear got out from the back seat. The 3 of them stood in the sun in front of the porch that Carol's father had built with his own hands, and none of them said anything for a while. Then Bear walked down the gravel driveway, slowly, all the way to the end where the road bent past the mailbox. He turned around. He sat down. He looked back up the driveway at Connor. Connor smiled. He said, "All right, boy." He walked down the driveway. He walked all the way to the end. He sat down on the gravel beside his dog, in the sun, at the exact spot where Bear had been keeping watch for over 1,000 days. He looped an arm around Bear's shoulders. He looked at the bend in the road where a red logging truck used to appear every afternoon at 5:30. He looked at the empty stretch of blacktop. He said, in a quiet voice that only the dog could hear, "I made it home, buddy. I made it home." Bear did not move his eyes off the bend of the road. He leaned against Connor's ribs. He did not need to watch the road anymore, but he watched it anyway, the way an old man watches the horizon out of habit, because a habit that has kept you alive for 3 years is not something you set down all at once. Connor understood. He did not try to move him. He just sat beside him. He watched the road with him. That was the deal now. It had always been the deal. Linda Voss came down the county road at the usual time in her walking shoes with her notebook under her arm. She stopped at the end of the driveway. She saw the 2 of them sitting there in the sun. She smiled a very small smile. She did not disturb them. She set a fresh, chipped enamel bowl of water down on the gravel, as she had done almost every day for 3 years. Bear glanced at it, then at her, then back at the road. Linda Voss walked on. There is a version of this story that ends there, in the sun, with a man and his dog on a driveway. That is the version most people know, if they know it at all. That is the version the county paper ran in the summer when the plea deals came through in a small, kind piece by a young reporter who did not have the space for the whole thing. That is the version Ray Emmett tells at the feed store when somebody new asks about the yellow dog that sits on the porch of the Hayes place every afternoon at 5:30, waiting patiently for a red pickup that always comes home now. Ray tells the version that ends in the sun. It is a good version. It is not the whole one. The whole one has one more small thing in it. It happened a year after the hearing. Connor was in the barn one morning, working on the old pickup. He had gotten it running again by then. Bear was outside in the driveway, at his post, at 5:30 in the afternoon. The way he always was, even though Connor was home, even though Connor came out of the barn every evening at that time and walked down to the mailbox to greet him. It had become a small ritual, one that neither of them was willing to give up. Connor came out of the barn on this particular afternoon with grease on his hands. He walked down the gravel. Bear turned his head and looked at him, then back at the road, then back at him. Then Bear did something new. He stood up. He walked up to Connor all the way. He pressed his broad, brindle head against the man's left hand, the hand that had always held the leash, exactly as he had done on the afternoon Connor came home. He held his head there for a long moment. Then he turned around and walked at his own steady pace back up the gravel driveway to the porch. He climbed the steps. He lay down on the boards under the swing. He did not sit at the end of the driveway again, not once for the rest of his life. He would walk down to the mailbox with Connor sometimes in the evenings for the pleasure of the walk. He would ride in the cab of the pickup on short trips into town, with his amber eyes on the road ahead. But the vigil at the end of the driveway was over. He had made a decision. He had, in his careful animal way, closed the file. Connor stood in the gravel and watched his dog walk up to the porch on the afternoon he made that decision. And Connor understood something in that moment that he would carry with him for the rest of his own life. He understood that Bear had not been waiting 3 years for a man. Bear had been waiting 3 years for a promise. The promise was that Connor would come home. That was the promise Connor had made every afternoon for 8 years, without ever putting words to it, when he turned that red logging truck onto Birchwood Lane at 5:30 in the afternoon. Bear had held Connor to that promise for 1,000 days after a wet October night should have cancelled it. And now that Connor had come home and had stayed home and had proved that he was going to keep coming home, Bear had, in his own time, released him from the watch. Connor walked up to the porch. He sat down on the swing. Bear put his chin on his boot. Connor scratched him gently behind the ear. He said, "Thank you." He said it out loud. He said it plain. He said, "I did not know a dog could do what you did. I did not know a person could do what you did." He said, "I am not going anywhere anymore." Bear did not lift his head. He did not need to. He knew. The story spread quietly, the way stories in country places spread, from Ray Emmett's feed store to the diner, to the church potluck, to a young reporter's laptop, to a small square of newspaper, to somebody's cousin somewhere. And eventually it became one of those stories that people tell about a dog who waited. There are a lot of those stories. Most of them, when you look at them closely, are about something else. This one is about a dog. But it is also about a woman who was one phone call away from letting a house go and who did not let it go, and about a mail carrier who wrote things down in a notebook because that was her habit, and about a small country lawyer who spoke slowly, and about a sheriff's deputy who had waited 9 years for the right question to ask, and about a brother who did not know his own name for 3 years and then found it again at the end of a gravel driveway, in the fur of an animal who had never once considered the possibility of giving up. If you drive out on the county road past Birchwood Lane on a summer evening even now, you can see the two of them on the porch, the man on the swing, the dog at his feet, the maple tree in the front yard, the pair at the fence, the small white farmhouse a father built with his own hands. You can see, if you know where to look, the flat grey stone that used to be a bench at the end of the driveway near the mailbox, where a chipped enamel bowl of water sat every day for 3 years, and where an old friend of the family used to sit and speak in a steady voice about small things. Beside it now is a plain wooden marker, hand-cut, hand-carved, the letters burned in with a wire that Connor Hayes made in his own barn out of a piece of oak from a tree that came down on the property in a January ice storm. The marker says only one thing. It says he waited here. He waited here every day. He was Bear. He is still, most afternoons at 5:30, on the porch. Not on the driveway. On the porch. He is older now. His muzzle has gone white. He does not need to watch the bend of the road, because the man who used to come down that road at 5:30 in the afternoon is on the porch beside him, with a hand on his back, watching the pear tree at the fence. That is the whole one. That is the version that has the reunion in it, and the courthouse, and the mirror in the woods, and the man in the grey suit on the porch, and the small, tight laugh on a telephone. But if you had to pick one image from it to keep, if you were told you could only keep one, you would probably pick the same one everybody picks. You would pick the moment on the gravel driveway on a Wednesday afternoon in early April, when a man who did not remember his own name walked out of a small sedan into the sun, and a big brindle mutt walked out from the porch slowly all the way and pressed his head against the man's left hand and closed his amber eyes and stayed there. You would pick the moment when whatever the doctors could not give back came back anyway, at the end of a gravel driveway, in one quiet, unhurried moment between a man and a dog who had waited. If this story moved you, leave a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one. Share it with somebody who believes in what an animal can carry when the world tries to make them set it down, because sometimes the smallest heart in the story is the one that keeps everything else from falling apart, and sometimes the shortest road home is the one that takes the longest to find. Bear found it. Connor found it. And at the end of a gravel driveway on Birchwood Lane, in the low honey light of a spring afternoon, so did the rest of us.